Hello everyone, I'm George from Ireland. So I'm making this video because it's the 100th anniversary of the truce which ended the conflict in Ireland, at least temporarily. That was the 11th of July 1921. So exactly a century ago, the Crown Forces and the Irish Republican Army were to stop fighting each other. What had been going on in the run-up to this period? Well, Irish nationalists called it the Irish War of Independence. Unionists, I suppose they'd call it the First Troubles. So at this time, the whole of Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, not just Northern Ireland. And we were represented in the UK Parliament at Westminster. However, many people in Ireland, possibly a majority, wanted Ireland to secede from the United Kingdom and become a completely separate state, probably a republic. And the party which was spearheading that campaign was called Sinn Féin. In Irish it means ourselves alone. And from January 1919 there'd been an insurgency, and the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, was that insurgent force that was fighting against the British Army and the Royal Irish Constabulary. The Royal Irish Constabulary was the police. RIC is often known as for short. There was some low-level fighting. In about 2.5 years, about 2,000 people were killed. Now, that's bad. I preferred nobody got killed. So what was the population of Ireland at the time? The Irish population was about 4.5 million at the time. So it was well under 1% of the population was killed. Well under 1 in 1,000 people was killed. It's more like 1 in 2,000 people was killed in that conflict in 2.5 years. So the level of violence shouldn't be overstated. And the IRA were usually using hit-and-run tactics. There was obviously some violence in Dublin, more fighting in the countryside. The IRA were most successful in West Cork and South Tipperary. And there were a few districts there where the Crown Forces wouldn't go even in daylight hours by July 1921. But the degree of success of the IRA is often overstated by their partisans, and so people should try not to let their political preferences cloud their analysis of this period. Even if you're a zealous Republican and think that the IRA's cause was entirely righteous, that you shouldn't automatically conclude that the IRA was victorious. Or even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool loyalist and you think the IRA was absolutely foul, then you shouldn't automatically think that the IRA was a dismal failure. So the truth is somewhere in between. But so not that many casualties have been caused to the Crown Forces, under 1,000. The IRA probably suffered a bit more, and obviously civilians were killed too. Now, there was a sectarian aspect to this. Ireland was about 75% Catholic. Most Catholics are nationalists, which would mean we want autonomy for Ireland, or perhaps complete independence. Whereas the Protestant minority were overwhelmingly unionist, which is to say they wish to maintain the union between Ireland and Great Britain. So the Protestant community is not evenly dispersed throughout the country. They were heavily concentrated in the northeast. So Ireland, as you may know, is divided into 32 counties. So there have been peace feelers put out earlier in December 1920 to see whether an accommodation could be reached between His Majesty's government and the IRA, but it came to naught. So there was a back channel. The Archbishop of Perth came to Ireland to try to act as a mediator between the two sides, the Catholic Archbishop, that is. When I say Perth, I mean Perth, Australia, and he was especially keen to bring about a peaceful settlement to the dispute, since his nephew had been killed earlier. So a lot of RIC, that's police officers, have been killed by the IRA. Others have been invalided out. So some of them reached retirement age. There was natural attrition, people just dying of natural causes, but very few volunteers coming through from 1919 to 1921. Some of them terrified, and so they resigned over that. Others of them somewhat sympathetic to the IRA and left for that reason, because the RIC was overwhelmingly Irish, and there were a handful of RIC men who were actually playing a double game, and they were in cahoots with the IRA, or agreeing to surrender their station, hand over their weapons because they had rifles, rather than get killed, or so just out of fear, or sometimes because they generally approved of the IRA's cause, perhaps a combination of two in other cases. So because of the shortage of manpower for the RIC, the government actively recruited ex-soldiers and ex-RAF men, so far as I know, no Royal Naval personnel, former Royal Naval personnel, in Great Britain. So for the first time, a significant number of RIC officers came from Scotland, Wales and England, and they had to be ex-military. Remember, the First World War had just ended, and so there were well over 1 million unemployed ex-servicemen. They came over to Ireland and they formed the RIC Special Reserve. But there was a dearth of RIC uniforms, which was bottle green, looked almost black. So they had to wear a mixture of RIC, very dark green clothes, and khaki clothes, as in that was British Army standard issue in the First World War. So because of it looking almost black and then this muddy brown colour, they were dubbed the Black and Tans contumely by a Limerick comedian in a theatre when they arrived in March 1920, but the name stuck. There was a pack of hounds, the Scartine Hunt, in County Limerick, who were known as Black and Tans because those dogs had those colours. But the epithet stuck, and their role was counterinsurgency. They were not there to perform ordinary police duties like catching pickpockets and finding lost children, though yes, they were officially police officers. Their role was quasi-military. Now, the IRA and the RIC, despite being both Christians, did not love their enemies. So anyway, the Crown Forces would say the IRA was outside the Geneva Convention. They didn't wear uniforms. They weren't fighting for a sovereign state. They often deliberately killed unarmed people, and so on. And so they didn't carry their weapons openly a lot of the time. So they sort of lowered standards of chivalry on both sides, as Montgomery observed, that British Field Marshal who was fighting in Ireland at the time. So people who were taken prisoner by the RIC were sometimes beaten up. There were allegations of torture too. So some prisoners were legally executed after a trial, as in hanged or executed by firing squad. Others were killed in custody. Were they trying to escape, as the RIC often claimed? Did they try to grab a gun off their guards? Or were they just killed for no good reason? Because, of course, prisoners aren't to be killed. You've got them in your power. Unless they're legally executed or trying to run away, they must be kept alive. Because you want to persuade more people to surrender by them knowing that they'll be treated humanely if they do surrender. So get your enemy to do what you want him to do. The other one is, dead men tell no tales. You want information on these people. So intelligence is vital. Finding out what's going on in the enemy organisation. And the IRA was rather better than that. The Crown Forces were not terribly good at intelligence. Didn't manage to successfully penetrate the IRA. Not many spies, a few of them caught and shot. But the IRA, certainly in Cork, was swept this sort of spy mania. There was spy fever, had a witch hunt against ex-servicemen, or particularly Protestants, often property people, and well over 100 people killed by the Cork IRA, supposed being spies. At the same time, the Belfast IRA didn't kill a single person as a spy. So most of these so-called informants killed by the IRA were innocent. The people least likely to have it. I mean, the profile of an IRA volunteer was usually a working-class Catholic from a non-farming background, whereas the people being killed were often wealthy, middle-aged Protestant landlords, those who were least likely to be in the IRA. There were very few Protestants in the IRA. There were also loyalist terrorists in the north, the Ulster Protestant Association, who murdered hundreds of Catholic civilians. The Catholics, the IRA also killed Protestant civilians. But this 11th of July truce that stopped fighting between the Crown Forces and the IRA almost entirely. There was the occasional breach. But in the north, the IRA and the Ulster Protestant Association, they continued their internecine sectarian campaign through into 1922, and it would have finally petered out, partly because those northern IRA units came down to the south to fight in the Irish Civil War, which kicked off on Midsummer's Day, 1922. That's another story. So it was a seminal moment in Irish history. Then a Sinn Féin delegation was invited to Downing Street, London, to discuss the future of Ireland. They'd all been elected members of the UK Parliament. They were invited on that basis. Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, and others. It was Robert, what's his name? Oh my goodness. Gavin Duffy went, and so on. Eamon de Valera, who called himself President of Ireland, he did not go, perhaps surprisingly. He did go to London occasionally. And there was I think it was 16-year-old Sean McBride going back and forth weekends from London to Dublin, carrying mails to detail the progress of the negotiations. That's enough from me, so please subscribe to my channel. Toodaloo.